The laughter hit him like a bullet he never saw coming. Xavier Dalton had heard plenty of sounds in his 34 years on this earth. The crack of thunder rolling across the Texas panhandle, the bellow of cattle during a night drive, the silence that follows a gunshot when every man in a saloon holds his breath. But nothing, not a single thing he had ever witnessed in all his years of living hard and riding harder, had prepared him for the sound of Opal Everett laughing. It was a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1882, and the sound stopped him dead in his tracks at the edge of the corral fence, one boot up on the lower rail, his hat tilted against the afternoon sun. She was standing 20 feet away near the old water pump, her dark hair coming loose from its pin, a streak of mud along her forearm from where she had been working the garden, and she was laughing at nothing more than a small brown goat that had gotten its head stuck clean through a bucket handle and was now spinning in panic circles. The laughter came out of her like something that had been locked in a vault for a decade, surprised into existence against its own will. It was high and clear, and then it broke into something deeper, uncontrolled, and she pressed one hand against her mouth as if she could put it back inside, as if laughing was a form of betrayal she had not intended to commit. Xavier felt the air leave his chest. He watched her shoulders shake. He watched her wipe her eyes with the back of her wrist. He watched her struggle to contain it and then fail and fail again. And the goat kept spinning, and she kept laughing, and Xavier Dalton, a man who had fought in range wars and slept under open skies and buried his father with his own 2 hands, decided in that exact moment that he was never leaving this ranch. He was never leaving her, not as long as he was breathing. He did not know then what that decision would cost him. He did not know then what secrets she carried, what dark past had stolen that laugh from her in the first place, what hidden motives lived in the shadows of her quiet eyes. He did not know about the man who was coming for her. He did not know about the trap already being laid, or the forced choice she would face before the summer was done. All he knew was the sound of Opal Everett laughing for the first time in years. And it was the most important thing he had ever heard. But to understand how Xavier Dalton came to stand at that fence on that particular afternoon, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier, to the morning he rode onto the Everett property with nothing but a worn saddle, a tired horse, and a letter of introduction from a man who owed him a favor. The spring of 1882 had not been kind to the Texas hill country. A drought the previous summer had scorched the grass down to nothing, and while the winter rains had helped, many ranchers were still rebuilding their herds, their fences, their confidence. The Everett land sat on 400 acres of gentle rolling hills south of the town of Hardin's Crossing, a small but respectable cattle operation that had once, by all accounts, been one of the finest in the county. By the time Xavier arrived, it had the look of a place that was fighting to remember what it used to be. The main house was solid, well-built limestone with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, but 2 of the porch boards needed replacing, and the barn roof had been patched so many times with different materials that it looked like a quilt from a distance. The corral held 14 head of cattle and 3 horses, which was not enough for 400 acres, and the fence line along the south pasture had clearly been letting cattle drift onto the neighboring property for at least a season. Xavier took all of this in as he rode up the long dirt path from the road, and he filed it away the way a man does when he is trying to understand the shape of a problem before he has been asked to solve it. He tied his horse at the post near the house and stepped up onto the porch just as the front door opened. He had been told that the Everett widow was a serious woman. His acquaintance Bill Marsh, who ran the general store in Hardin's Crossing, and had been the one to send word that the Everett place was looking for a hired hand, had described her as quiet, capable, and not particularly interested in conversation. He had said she had been running the ranch alone since her husband passed 18 months ago, and that she had managed it with a kind of grim determination that commanded respect even from men who thought women had no business running cattle operations. None of that had prepared Xavier for Opal Everett herself. She was 30 years old, though she carried herself with the contained stillness of someone older, someone who had been through weather both literal and figurative, and had come out the other side stripped of anything unnecessary. She was tall for a woman of that era, with the kind of straight posture that suggested she had decided a long time ago that she was not going to let anything bend her. Her eyes were a shade of gray-green that changed depending on where the light hit, and they were looking at him right now with an expression that was frank, assessing, and entirely without warmth. She had a rifle in her right hand, not pointed at him, just held, the way a woman holds a rifle when she lives alone and she does not yet know what category a man falls into. "Xavier Dalton," he said, taking off his hat. "Bill Marsh sent me. I have a letter." He produced the letter from his vest pocket and held it out. She took it without stepping off the porch, unfolded it with one hand while keeping the rifle in the other, read it, folded it again, and handed it back to him. "Can you fix a fence line?" she asked. "Yes, madam." "Can you shoe a horse?" "Yes, madam." "Can you take direction from a woman without spending all your energy being annoyed about it?" He held her gaze. "I have been taking direction from my mother since I was born, Mrs. Everett. I have not found it troublesome yet." Something moved across her face. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "The bunkhouse is behind the barn," she said. "It is small and the stove needs a new pipe fitting, which I will purchase the next time I go into town. You will sleep there. Your meals will be at the house, breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. I pay $12 a month and I expect full days of work." "That is fair," Xavier said. "I also expect that you keep your personal business personal. I do not need to know about your history, and you do not need to know about mine. This is a working arrangement, not a friendship." "Understood," he said. She nodded once, turned, and went back inside the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Xavier stood on the porch for a moment, hat in his hands, looking at the closed door. Then he put his hat back on, stepped off the porch, untied his horse, and led him around to the barn. He had worked on a dozen ranches before this one, and he had learned something about how to read a place. A ranch was like a person in many ways. You could tell a great deal about its character from what was cared for and what was neglected. The Everett Ranch told him that whoever was running it was doing their very best under circumstances that had been progressively harder than they should have been. The tools in the barn were clean and organized. The horses were well groomed and healthy. The cattle, though few in number, were in good condition. The house garden had been recently turned and planted with neat rows of beans, squash, and corn. What was neglected was the structural work. The fences, the barn roof, the porch boards, the kind of heavy labor that required either strength or a second pair of hands, neither of which Opal Everett had in sufficient supply. Xavier began with the south fence line the next morning. He worked steadily from first light, driving new posts where the old ones had rotted, stretching wire, reattaching boards. It was hard, honest work, and he did not rush it, because rushing fence work was how you ended up doing it twice. Opal brought him water at mid-morning without being asked, set the bucket and ladle down nearby, and left without saying anything. He nodded his thanks to her, retreating back. At noon she put food on the table in the kitchen, beans, cornbread, salt pork, and coffee, and they sat across from each other and ate in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. She read a letter while she ate. He looked out the window at the pasture. "The south fence will be done by tomorrow afternoon," he said when he was nearly finished. She looked up from the letter. "The post holes are deep enough, 3 feet," he said. She nodded, went back to the letter. "After the fence I will get to the barn roof if that is agreeable," he said. She set the letter down. "I have materials for the south half, not enough for the north half yet. The south half is the critical part. The north section can wait for another month if need be." She looked at him for a moment, the way she had on the porch, that same assessing quality, and then she nodded again and picked up the letter. That was the pattern of their early days. Work, functional conversation about the work, silence, more work. Xavier did not push. He was not, by nature, an intrusive man. He had spent enough years in enough different places to know that people were like cattle in a pasture. If you rushed toward them, they scattered. If you moved slowly and without threat, they eventually came to you. He did not ask about her husband. He did not ask about her family or her past, or how she had come to be running this ranch alone. He did what he was hired to do, and he did it well, and he let her observe that without comment. What he did do, quietly and without announcement, was small additional things. He noticed that the water pump sometimes stuck on the upstroke, and he fixed the mechanism one afternoon after he had finished the primary fence work. He noticed that the gate on the chicken coop had a broken latch that meant she had to prop a rock against it. So he fashioned a new latch from spare iron in the barn. He noticed that the road from the house to the main gate had a section where water pooled badly after rain, making it muddy and difficult for the wagon. So he spent a Sunday morning digging a small drainage channel along the low side. He did none of this to impress her. Or rather, he told himself he did not. He did it because it was obvious and necessary, and because doing obvious and necessary things when you saw them was simply the way he had been raised. But he noticed that she noticed. She was observant in the way that people who have been managing alone are observant. She saw every change in her environment, cataloged it, understood its implications. One morning she came out to find him already halfway up a ladder fixing a loose section of the porch roof that she had not mentioned, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder for a moment looking up at him. "I did not ask you to do that," she said. "No, madam," he agreed. "It has been on my list." "I imagine your list is long," he said. She was quiet for a moment. He kept working. "It is," she said finally, and went back inside. He discovered her history in pieces, the way you discover the shape of a landscape in the dark, a little at a time, one landmark at a time, until eventually the whole thing forms itself into something coherent. From Bill Marsh. On the one occasion Xavier rode into Hardin's crossing for supplies in his first week. He learned that Opal's husband, Thomas Everett, had died of a fever 18 months earlier, leaving the ranch in better condition than it now was, but not, as some people in town quietly suggested, as well maintained as it might have been. Thomas Everett had been considered a decent man, reasonably hardworking, but he had also been known to spend time at the saloon in Hardin's crossing, and to have a temperament that people described with careful, non-committal words like strong-willed and particular in his ways. Xavier understood what those words meant. He had met men like that. He learned from the neighboring rancher to the east, a blunt, leather-faced man named Chester Howell, who rode over one afternoon to discuss the fence line they shared, that Opal Everett had grown up in San Antonio and had come to Hardin's crossing when she married Thomas at the age of 22. "She does not talk much," Chester said, which Xavier already knew. "Effective woman," Xavier said, which shut down that line of conversation. What he could not learn from anyone else, because no one else seemed to know, were the smaller things. The way she moved through her own house with a kind of careful precision, as if she was always conscious of where she was in relation to everything else. The way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and looked out the window at nothing for a long moment before returning to what she was doing. The way she never raised her voice, not once, not even when the young milk cow got into the garden and ate half the bean plants. She had just looked at the damage, closed her eyes briefly, and then begun the work of replanting with an expression of contained resignation that was somehow more affecting than anger would have been. He learned that she was capable of tremendous warmth, but that it existed at a remove, directed outward at the animals rather than the people around her. He watched her with the horses and saw a completely different person, unhurried, gentle, talking to them in a low voice that he could not quite make out from a distance, but that clearly communicated something, because the horses leaned toward her like plants toward light. He found himself doing the same thing, without quite meaning to. By the end of his second week, the silence between them at meals had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of two strangers who had nothing to say to each other. It had become something more like the silence of two people who are choosing what to say carefully, which implied the existence of things to say. It was during the third week that the goat incident happened, and the laughter, and the decision that changed everything. In the days after that afternoon at the corral, Xavier found himself in a peculiar state that he did not immediately know how to name. He had been attracted to women before. He had been fond of women before. But what he felt after hearing Opal Everett laugh was something different and more troubling, because it was not based on anything she had done for him or offered him or shown him. It was based on a need. Specifically, his very powerful need to hear that sound again. He started paying attention in a different way. He noticed what made her almost smile: the milk cow's tendency to toss her head indignantly when tied, the way the meadowlarks organized themselves on the fence wire in the morning, a paragraph in a letter from her sister in San Antonio that she read, and then folded very carefully before setting aside. He noticed what made her shoulders tighten: the sight of a wagon coming up the road before she could identify who was in it, the sound of raised voices from the direction of the town road in the evenings, the name of a man named Reginald Hale, which came up once in a conversation between Opal and Chester Howell, when Xavier happened to be working nearby, and which made her face go very still in a way that he filed away for later consideration. He did not ask about Reginald Hale, not yet, but he listened. One evening, nearly 4 weeks after his arrival, he was sitting on the bunkhouse step in the blue dusk, sharpening his knife when Opal came around the corner of the barn unexpectedly, carrying a lantern and looking for something she had left in the barn. She stopped when she saw him, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the 15 feet of yard. "I left my planting schedule in the barn," she said. "I will get it," he said, standing. "I can manage. I am sure you can." He walked past her into the barn, found the folded paper on the workbench where she had been studying it that morning, and brought it back out. She took it from him. Their fingers did not touch, but she was close enough that he could smell hay and wood smoke and something faintly floral that he had no context for, something that he thought might simply be her. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, madam." She did not go. He noticed this. He stood still and waited. "You have been very helpful," she said, and the words came out with a slight difficulty, as if she were working through a translation, as if helpfulness was a concept she had some reason to be careful around. "I appreciate the work," he said, which was true. She looked at him. "That is not the same thing as saying you are glad to be here." "No," he said, "it is not." The lantern light moved between them in the evening breeze. "Are you," she asked, "glad to be here?" He considered the question the way she had taught him to consider things, by the example of her own precision. "Yes," he said, "more than I expected to be." She absorbed this. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the house. He watched the lantern light bob away through the dusk and disappear behind the closing door. He sat back down on the bunkhouse step and did not pick up the knife again for a while. The question of Reginald Hale answered itself about a week later, and the answer was ugly. It was a Saturday, and Opal had driven the wagon into Hardin's crossing for supplies, which she did twice a month. Xavier had stayed at the ranch because there was a calf that had been unwell for 2 days, and he did not want to leave it alone. He was in the barn checking on the animal when he heard the wagon coming back up the road, and something in the speed of it, a little too fast, made him straighten and walk to the barn door. Opal brought the wagon to a stop outside the house with more abruptness than usual. She climbed down from the seat and began unloading without looking at him, and he saw the tight set of her mouth and the particular way she was holding her shoulders, and he walked over without being asked. "I will take those," he said, reaching for the flour sacks. She let him take them without protest, which told him something was wrong. He carried the first load into the kitchen and set it on the table, came back for the second, and by the time he brought that in, she was standing at the window over the dry sink looking out at nothing. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked, setting the sacks down. "No," she said. "All right," he said. He went out and finished unloading the wagon and led the horse to the barn and unharnessed him and got him settled with water and feed, taking his time, giving her space. When he came back to the house, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she looked at him when he came in with an expression that was not quite asking for something, but was not quite not asking either. He sat down across from her and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "Reginald Hale came to the store while I was there," she said. Xavier kept his expression neutral. "I have heard the name. He wants to buy the ranch," she said. "He has been wanting to buy it since before Thomas died. He comes every few weeks to renew the offer, and each time the offer is a little lower than the last." She paused. "Today he said that it would be in my best interest to sell quickly, before I find myself without the resources to maintain it. He said this in front of 3 other people. He said it publicly. To humiliate me," she said, and the flatness with which she said it was somehow worse than anger. "To make it seem as though he was doing me a favor. He is not doing me a favor. He wants the land along the creek for the water rights, and he has wanted it for years, and he believed that Thomas dying would make the path to it clear." Xavier studied the surface of his coffee, "And the path is not clear. The path is not clear," she said. "How much pressure has he put on you?" "Beyond the public offers." Her fingers tightened on the cup. "He has spoken to the bank about my loan, nothing actionable yet, but the implication is present. He has also spoken with the men I have approached about seasonal work, and 2 of them declined to hire on here after those conversations. I cannot prove it was his doing, but I am not a fool." Xavier looked up from his coffee. The word had come to him several different ways over the last weeks. The fence line that had been cut, not broken, cut, which he had repaired without comment. The missing tools from the barn that had reappeared 3 days later in the wrong location. The young steer that had been found on the wrong side of a fence with no clear explanation. He had assumed some of this was ordinary misfortune and some of it perhaps carelessness, but now the picture assembled itself differently. "Has he threatened you directly?" Xavier asked. "He does not make direct threats," she said. "He is too careful for that. He makes suggestions. He expresses concern. He does everything in a language that sounds like helpfulness and means something else entirely." Xavier was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. The fence along the south property line was not just in poor repair, he said carefully. Sections of it had been cut. Recently. I did not say so at the time because I was not sure of the context, but I am sure of it now. The silence that followed was very still. He is trying to make it look as though I cannot manage, she said, and then, very quietly, he is also trying to frighten me. Has he succeeded? Xavier asked. She looked him in the eye and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, a more complicated one than a simple no would have been. Xavier put his cup down. I am going to stay through the summer at minimum, he said. I want you to know that. I am not going to leave you short-handed. She was looking at him with that frank, assessing quality again, and this time there was something else in it, something that might have been gratitude but was fighting very hard not to be. That is a significant commitment for a hired hand, she said. It is, he agreed. She studied him for another moment, and then she looked away out the window and said, "All right." He picked up his coffee cup again, and they sat in that kitchen as the afternoon light shifted, and the day cooled, and neither of them said anything more about it, because nothing more needed to be said right then. The weeks that followed were a peculiar time, and Xavier would think about them later as the period when everything was changing without either of them acknowledging that it was changing. He moved the rhythm of his work to address the most visible vulnerabilities first, the fence lines, which he now monitored with more attention than before, the herd count, which he took careful written inventory of, the roof, which he finished and which stopped the rain damage to the hay. He also began, quietly and without announcement, to be more present in the visible ways, to be seen in the yard and at the fence line and on the road, because a ranch with a capable man working it looked different from a ranch that appeared to be managed by a woman alone. And while he had views about the injustice of that reality, he was also practical enough to use it. Opal had views about it too. "I do not like what we are doing," she said one morning, when she had seen him wave at Chester Howell's passing wagon in a particular way that communicated, without words, that this ranch was occupied and tended. "Neither do I," he said honestly. "But Hale is playing a game with rules that favor him, and until we change the rules, we play on his terms or we lose." She was quiet for a moment, her hands busy sorting seeds at the kitchen table, and he watched her work with the thoroughness and precision she brought to everything. "I should not have to depend on a man's presence to make this ranch look legitimate," she said. "No," he said, "you should not. And I can tell you clearly that in 20 years this conversation will have a different answer. But right now, in this county, in this year, this is what we have." She looked up at him. "You are angry about it." "I am," he said. Something shifted in her eyes. "I thought you would tell me I was being unreasonable," she said. "You are the least unreasonable person I have met," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked back down at the seeds, and he thought he saw a trace of color along her cheekbone, though the morning light was uncertain and he might have been wrong. He was not wrong. In the second month of his time at the Everett Ranch, the nature of the work changed again, because more people arrived, not enemies, but opportunities. The Hardin's Crossing Cattle Association held its spring meeting, and Opal attended, taking the wagon in alone as she had done before. And this time, Xavier stayed at the ranch because the sick calf needed watching, and also because he thought her being seen to represent her own interests without a man standing beside her was important. She came back from that meeting with a contract for 30 head of cattle from a breeder in Austin at a fair price, secured entirely on the strength of her own negotiation. And she told Xavier about it at supper with a composure that could not quite conceal the quiet satisfaction underneath it. "That is excellent," he said. "I was also asked to join the association's committee on water rights," she said. He looked at her, And the irony of that, given Hale's interest in your water rights, is not lost on me, she said, and the ghost of a smile moved across her face. He realized then that the ghost of a smile had been appearing more frequently. He had been cataloging them without fully admitting to himself that he was doing so. The cattle arrived in mid-June, 14 additional head that significantly improved the herd's economic viability, and their arrival required several days of concentrated work that kept both Xavier and Opal busy from before sunrise to after dark. They worked together during those days with a wordless efficiency that felt natural rather than practiced, each of them seeming to know without discussion where the other would be and what would be needed. On the third evening, when the last of the cattle had been settled and counted and the gates were secure, they sat on the porch in the cooling night air, too tired to move immediately, and Xavier looked up at the sky that was vast and dense with stars, and he thought that he could not remember the last time he had been this specifically content. "I want to tell you something," Opal said. He looked at her. She was looking out at the dark yard, not at him. "I was not always this way," she said. "Quiet and careful, and whatever it is I am now, I was different before." He waited. "Thomas was not a cruel man," she said, and the care with which she chose the word told him everything about what it meant that she chose it. "He was not a cruel man, but he was a very specific man. He had very specific ideas about how things should be and how I should be, and after enough time, I conformed to them. It was easier than not conforming." Xavier looked at the stars. "There are things I stopped doing because they annoyed him," she said, laughing loudly. "Having opinions about money, reading in the evening when there was still work that could be done, small things individually, accumulated they become a different person. And now," he said, she was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know who I am outside of all that," she said. "I am learning. It is slower than I expected." He turned to look at her profile in the darkness. "You are doing extraordinarily well," he said, with a quiet directness that he had not intended to use, that came out without calculation. She turned to look at him, and in the starlight her eyes were very pale and very serious. "I do not know what to do with that," she said honestly. "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "It is just true." She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked away, and they sat in the silence of the Texas night until the mosquitoes got bad enough that going inside was preferable. And they went inside and said good night. And Xavier lay in his bunk in the small, warm bunkhouse, listening to the crickets and the cattle and the distant coyotes, and thought about a woman learning who she was, and about what an extraordinary thing it was to be present for. He did not sleep for a long time. The situation with Reginald Hale came to a head in July, earlier than Xavier had anticipated, and in a way he had not specifically prepared for. Hale was 53 years old, a large man who had made his money in land speculation and cattle brokering, and who moved through Hardin's crossing with the particular confidence of a man who had learned that most problems yielded to money or pressure, and who had not yet been clearly wrong. He owned several properties north of town and had interests in others, and the Everett land along the creek was the one piece of the puzzle that would complete his water rights along a stretch of the county that was increasingly valuable as the region grew. He arrived at the Everett Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in July with two men Xavier had not seen before, coming up the road in a fine buggy that was deliberately overqualified for the road conditions, which was itself a statement. Xavier was at the barn when they arrived, and he walked toward the house at a pace that was unhurried but deliberate. Opal had come out onto the porch. She was holding neither her rifle nor anything else. Her hands were at her sides, and she stood very straight. "Mrs. Everett," Hale said, removing his hat with a courtesy that was purely theatrical. "I hope I find you well." "Mr. Hale," she said. He noticed Xavier approaching and let his gaze move to him with an assessment that was not friendly. "I see you have retained additional help." "Mr. Dalton works for me," Opal said. "Can I help you, Mr. Hale?" "I wanted to speak with you about a revised offer," Hale said. "I believe you will find the new terms more than reasonable, given the current difficulties in the cattle market." "The cattle market is not particularly difficult," Opal said. "I have recently contracted for additional stock at favorable prices." Something moved through Hale's expression. "Nevertheless," he said, "I believe a conversation would be in our mutual interest." "I do not share that belief," Opal said. "I have told you on 4 separate occasions that this ranch is not for sale. That position has not changed." Xavier had reached the porch steps and he stopped there, 1 foot on the bottom step, not crowding her, not speaking, just present. Hale's eyes moved between the two of them. "Mrs. Everett," Hale said, and his tone shifted, shedding some of its courtesy and revealing something harder underneath. "I want to be direct with you. Your loan with the Hardin County Bank is due for review in September. I have some influence with the board of directors. I would prefer that influence to work in your favor." The air on the porch was very still. Opal looked at him for a moment, and then she said, clearly and without any change in her expression, "Are you telling me that you will use your relationship with the bank to pressure my loan if I do not sell to you?" Hale opened his mouth. "Because if so," she continued, in that same even tone, "I would like you to understand that I have kept a very careful record of every conversation I have had with you, including the dates and witnesses present, and that I have corresponded with my attorney in San Antonio about this matter. I would also like you to understand that I have been elected to the Water Rights Committee of the Hardin's Crossing Cattle Association, which means that any attempt on your part to acquire water rights along this section of the creek will require my active approval, which you will not receive." Hale stared at her. "And I would like you to understand," she finished, "that the next time you come onto my property without an invitation, I will have you removed. Good afternoon, Mr. Hale." She went inside. The door did not slam. She closed it with a quiet deliberateness that was somehow more final than slamming would have been. Xavier stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Reginald Hale. Hale looked back at him. "She is a formidable woman," Hale said, and his voice had a quality that Xavier recognized as the sound a man makes when he is recalculating. "Yes," Xavier said, "she is." Hale put his hat back on, nodded once in a way that communicated nothing specific, but that felt like a retreat, and got back into the buggy. His 2 men got onto their horses. Xavier watched them all the way down the road and around the bend before he turned and went inside. Opal was standing at the kitchen window. Her hands were shaking. She saw him see this and she clasped them together in front of her, straightening. "You had that planned," he said. "The letter to my attorney, yes," she said. "The committee position, that was genuine luck. But I have been planning for this conversation for several weeks." He looked at her. "You did not tell me." "No," she said. "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to do it myself," she said. He understood that completely. "Yes," he said, "you did." She looked at him, and her shoulders came down slightly from where they had been, up near her ears, and she unclenched her hands. "Will he stop?" Xavier asked. "I do not know," she said honestly. "He is a practical man. I have made the cost higher than he may want to pay, but I do not know." "We keep watching the fence lines," Xavier said. "Yes," she said. They stood in the kitchen, and outside the July heat pressed against the windows, and inside it was quieter. And after a moment she moved to the stove and put the kettle on for coffee, and he sat down at the table, and that was all. But it was not nothing. The weeks after Hale's visit were quieter in the way that a sky is quiet after a storm has passed, with that particular quality of brightness and stillness that is also slightly watchful, because you have learned that storms come, and you have not yet decided whether this one is over or just resting. Xavier continued to check the fence lines. He continued to take inventory. He did not relax his vigilance, but he also did not let it consume the other work, the ordinary good work of maintaining the land and the animals and the infrastructure of a ranch that was visibly, incrementally improving. What changed in those weeks was harder to quantify. Opal had begun to talk more. Not in the sense that she had become expansive or voluble. She was still a person of thoughtful economy with words, but the silences between them had changed texture again, become more porous, open in the way that implies a door ajar rather than a door closed. She asked him questions about where he had worked before, about what he had seen of the territory, about his thoughts on cattle breeds and pasture management, and the likelihood of railroad expansion reaching the county. She had a precise, curious mind that had clearly been working for years on whatever she was given to work on, and it came out in the kinds of questions she asked. He learned that she had loved Thomas Everett when she married him. This she said plainly, without apology or self-excuse, and it cost her something to say it. He could see that. "I was 22 and I thought love meant the same thing to both of us," she said. "I learned that it did not." He did not push that, but he thought about it. One afternoon in late July, he was working on the new section of corral fence he was adding to give the expanded herd more range, and she brought him water as she occasionally did. And instead of leaving, she stayed, leaning against the opposite fence post and watching him work. He was aware of her watching him in the way that you are always aware when a specific person is watching you, with a particular quality of attention. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He kept working. "Yes. Why have you not married?" He drove the next post with the mallet and thought about the answer. "I never found the right situation," he said. "I have spent most of my adult life in motion. It is difficult to build something with someone when you are always somewhere different." "And now," she said. He stopped and looked at her. She was looking at him with those gray-green eyes that changed in the light, and the late afternoon sun was hitting her from the side, and she had a streak of dirt on her cheek from the garden, and her hair was partly down, and she looked like the most real person he had ever been in a room with, or a field with, or anywhere with. "I told you I was staying through the summer," he said. "You did," she said. "I remember." "I meant it," he said. "I mean more of it than I said at the time." She held his gaze for a long moment. The horses moved in the far pasture. A meadowlark sang from somewhere on the fence line. "Xavier," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was so specifically arresting that he actually went still for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with listening. "Yes," he said. "I am trying to tell you something," she said, "but I do not have a great deal of practice with it, and I would ask for your patience." "You have it," he said immediately. She looked at the fence post. She looked at the far pasture. She looked back at him. "I am aware that you have feelings regarding me, and I want you to know that I am not unaware of my own feelings on that subject. But I am also a woman who married once in a hurry and paid a long price for it, and I will not be hurried again." He nodded. "I am not asking you to be hurried." "I know," she said. "That is part of what I am trying to say." She looked at him very directly. "I am grateful for it." He looked at her. He wanted to say a great many things. He said, "All right." She pushed off the fence post and went back toward the house, and he watched her go. And then he picked up the mallet and drove the next post with considerably more force than was strictly necessary. August in the Texas Hill Country was relentless in its heat, and the work changed to accommodate it. Earlier mornings, longer midday breaks, later evenings. The rhythm shifted and softened somewhat, and in the cooling afternoons when the light went gold and the shadows stretched long across the pasture, they sometimes found themselves sitting on the porch in the chairs there, talking or not talking, in a comfortable proximity that had grown so naturally, it was hard to say exactly when it had started feeling natural. He read in the evening sometimes, and she read, and occasionally one of them would read something aloud to the other, a newspaper story or a passage from a book. And those evenings had a quality of peaceful intimacy that Xavier would not have known how to request, and was simply grateful to inhabit. He started teaching her things about cattle management that she asked to know, not because she could not have learned them elsewhere, but because she asked him specifically, and he thought that was important, the asking. She already knew a great deal. She absorbed the rest with a precision that was consistent with everything else about her. She had opinions about what she learned and she expressed them, and sometimes she was right and he told her so, and sometimes she was not and she told him when he pointed this out with a candor that he found deeply refreshing. They argued about the pasture rotation schedule in a long dinner conversation that neither of them raised their voice for once, and that ended in her position being adopted, mostly because she had data and he had opinion, and he told her she was right and meant it, and she looked at him afterward with an expression that he realized might be unfamiliar to her, the expression of having won an argument with a man who conceded gracefully. "You are not annoyed," she said. "You were right," he said. "Thomas did not respond well to being corrected," she said. "I noticed that you felt the need to add that," he said. She looked at him. "I am always half waiting for things to change," she said quietly. "For there to be a version of you that appears when the accommodation runs out," he held her gaze. "There is no other version," he said. "I know that is a significant thing to ask you to believe." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am trying." "That is all I could ask," he said. It was 3 days later that she laughed the second time in his presence. It was not the wild, surprised, helpless laughter of the goat incident. It was a quieter thing, a laugh at something he said during supper about an incident with a bull in his second year of ranching, when he had been 20 and considerably more confident than competent. And the laugh came out of her cleanly and without the ambivalence of that first time, and she did not press her hand over her mouth. She just laughed, and then she looked at him with eyes that were bright, and he thought, "There it is. There she is." He had to look away because the feeling was too large for a kitchen table. The letter from Opal's sister Rosa arrived in late August, and it changed things, but not in the way that a threat changes things. It changed them in the way that a door opening changes the character of a room. Suddenly, there is more light and more air and more possibility. Rosa was 2 years younger than Opal, married with 3 children and living in San Antonio, and her letters to Opal were warm and full, and not infrequently contained very pointed questions. The relevant paragraph of this particular letter Opal read to Xavier one evening on the porch, which itself was an indication of how things had shifted. "She wants to know," Opal said, with a careful neutrality that was not entirely successful, "about my hired hand. She says that the level of detail I have included about the ranch's improvement this summer is inconsistent with how I wrote about the ranch before, and she wants to know whether there is a specific person she should thank for the apparent change in my circumstances, and she adds, she uses that word to mean more than the material kind." Xavier let the evening settle around that for a moment. "Your sister is perceptive," he said. "Aggressively so," Opal agreed. "What will you tell her?" Opal folded the letter. "I do not know yet," she said. "I am still working out what to say about things I do not entirely know how to say." He looked at her profile in the evening light. "I will not push you," he said. "I know," she said. "It has meant a great deal." They sat. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes." He looked out at the pasture, where the cattle were settling in the last of the day's light, and he chose his words with the care that she had, over the months, taught him by example. "I am in love with you," he said. "I am not saying that to require anything of you or to change what we are right now. I am saying it because it is true and because I think you should know it, and because I am not a man who has a hidden motive in telling you so. There is no trap in this. I am not going anywhere. And I will wait as long as you need." The silence after this was different from all the silences that had come before. Opal was very still. The evening breeze moved through the porch, and the meadowlarks were quiet now, and the first stars were beginning to show. Then she turned and looked at him, and her face had an expression that he thought might be the truest one he had seen her wear, open in a way that was clearly costing her, and she said, "I have been afraid to want something again." "I know," he said. "I do not know how to stop being afraid of it," she said. "Neither do I," he said, "but I think we could figure it out together." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm. Her hand was warm and slightly calloused from the work and steady. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that as the stars came fully out, and the night settled in over the hill country, and it was the most significant moment of his adult life, and he knew it while it was happening, which was a rare and important thing. What happened next took some time to happen, because Opal was not a person who could be rushed, and Xavier understood this and did not try. But the holding of hands became, over the following days, a regular thing, on the porch in the evenings, or walking between the house and the barn, or sitting at the kitchen table over coffee in the mornings. He learned the language of her hand, the way she held it when she was thinking, the way she held it when she was content, the slight increase in pressure when she was worried about something. She began to tell him things she had not told anyone. Not all at once, not in the manner of a confession, but gradually, in the way that a landscape reveals itself as you travel through it, a hill at a time, a valley at a time. She told him that her first 2 years of marriage had been the best of them, and that she had loved the ranch even then, the land itself, the way it felt to be responsible for a living piece of the earth. She told him that the difficulties had started slowly, and had accumulated so gradually that she had not been able to identify the moment when things had turned. She told him that Thomas had never hit her. She said this as though it were a limit of his virtue rather than a fact worth celebrating, which told Xavier a great deal about the shape of those years. She told him that she had cried, alone in the barn on the morning after Thomas's funeral, and that the crying had been complex, part grief, part guilt, part something she had not known the name for until much later, which was relief. She had hated herself for the relief. She still sometimes did. Xavier listened to all of this with the whole of his attention, which was the most important thing he had to give her, and when she was done talking he said, "You do not have to apologize for surviving things that were hard." She looked at him with that same too open expression. "You make things sound very simple," she said. "They are not simple," he said, "but they are survivable. You survived them, and you are here." She squeezed his hand. In September, as the first hints of a Texas autumn began to cool the evenings, and the grass showed signs of recovering from the summer heat, Opal received a formal notice from the Hardin County Bank that her loan review had been completed, and that the terms would continue unchanged for another year. There was no communication from Reginald Hale. It was the committee position that had done it, Xavier believed. Hale had calculated the cost and found it too high, and whatever pressure he had intended to apply to the bank, he had pulled back on. Whether this was a final retreat or simply a longer-term recalculation, Xavier did not know. But for now, the immediate threat had receded. He told Opal this carefully, not wanting her to relax entirely, because a man like Hale did not simply give up, he simply waited. But the immediate crisis was past. She received this news with a nod and a long exhale, and then she said, "I want to plant the north field next spring. I want to expand the garden into a proper kitchen garden, and I want to add a second barn pen for the new cattle." "All of that is achievable," he said. "I know," she said. "I am stating it because I want you to know that I am planning for a future here." He looked at her. "On this ranch," she said. "A future for this ranch, and whatever else that might mean." He took her hand. "Tell me what it means," he said. She looked at their joined hands, and then at him, and the morning light through the kitchen window fell across her face, and she was not beautiful in the conventional sense of that word. She was beautiful in the way that a landscape is beautiful, specific and real and entirely itself. "It means I do not want you to go," she said. "Not through the summer, not through the winter, not at all." He had been waiting for this, and he had been afraid without knowing it of the waiting, and now he was not afraid anymore. He lifted her hand and he pressed his lips against her knuckles, not romantically in a performed way, but in the way of a serious, sincere promise made with the best part of himself. "I am not going anywhere," he said, against her hand. She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she leaned forward and pressed her lips against his cheek, quickly, like a woman who has done something she decided to do before she could talk herself out of it. Then she pulled back and looked at him with color high in her cheeks and a directness that was both defiant and uncertain, as if she was daring him to make this strange. He smiled at her, not something easy or practiced, something genuine and a little undone, and she looked at that smile and something in her face released. "I want to write to Rosa," she said. "I want to tell her." "Good," he said. She squeezed his hand and stood up to write the letter. The autumn of 1882 settled over the Everett Ranch like a blanket, and with it came the kind of busy, productive peace that is its own form of abundance. The cattle were healthy, and the herd, now at 38 head, was the strongest it had been in years. The south fence was solid. The barn roof held against the fall rains. The expanded kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter with proper care, and the north field had been surveyed and planned for the spring planting Xavier had promised. Xavier and Opal moved through those weeks in a companionship that had been built so carefully and honestly that it now felt entirely natural, entirely theirs, like a language invented by two people specifically for each other. He kissed her properly for the first time on an October afternoon, when she had come into the barn to show him a letter from the Cattle Association confirming her committee reappointment. And she had been so pleased about it, carrying the letter with a controlled brightness that was entirely her own. And he had kissed her, and she had gone very still, and then kissed him back with a warmth that suggested she had been thinking about it for some time. After a moment, she pulled back and looked at him with an expression of careful consideration. "You have been patient," she said. "You were worth being patient for," he said. "You cannot know that with certainty," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I can," he said. She pressed her lips together and looked away toward the barn door, out at the autumn pasture, and then she looked back at him. "I think I was also worth being patient with," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, a specific reclaiming of something that had been taken from her, that made him put his hand gently against her face. "You were," he said. "You are." Rosa came to visit in November. She arrived on the stage from San Antonio with a small trunk and an enormous amount of energy. and she assessed Xavier Dalton within approximately 4 minutes of meeting him with the frank thoroughness of a woman who had been worried about her sister for years, and was now doing careful inventory of what had changed and why. She pulled Opal aside in the kitchen the morning after her arrival while Xavier was doing chores, and whatever they said to each other in that kitchen was private. But when Opal came out to the barn an hour later, her eyes were slightly bright, and she had the expression of someone who has been told things they already knew but needed to hear said out loud. Rosa liked Xavier. She expressed this without much ceremony on her second day when he was helping her down from the wagon after a trip to Hardin's crossing, and she said, "You are a good man. I can always tell. Please do not give me a reason to revise this opinion." "I will do my best," he said. "Opal has not been happy in a long time," Rosa said. "She is happy now. That matters more to me than anything else." "It matters more to me than anything else," he said. Rosa looked at him steadily, and then nodded with the decisive air of someone who has completed an important assessment and reached a satisfactory conclusion. She stayed for a week and left with the kind of specific satisfaction of a person whose worries have been substantially resolved. And Xavier drove her to the stage station in Hardin's crossing, and she hugged Opal for a long time at the station before she climbed aboard, and they watched the stage go, and Opal was quiet on the drive home in a way that was full rather than empty. "She approves of you," Opal said about a mile from the ranch. "I had the impression," he said. "She also told me I should stop analyzing everything and trust what I know," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "What do you know?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "That I am not afraid in the same way I was," she said. "That the fear is still there, but it is smaller than something else now, and the something else is you." He pulled the wagon to a stop in the road. There was nothing around them but hill and sky and the fading afternoon light. He turned to look at her. "Opal," he said. "Yes," she said. She was looking at him with those gray-green eyes clear as creek water. "Will you marry me?" he said. The question sat in the air between them, simple and enormous. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that a lesser man might have begun to worry. But he was not a lesser man, and he had learned to read her silences, and this one was not the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of a woman taking the full measure of a moment, feeling it completely before she answered. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness he had not known he was capable of, and she caught his hand against her cheek and held it there. "I want it to be a quiet ceremony," she said. "Whatever you want," he said. "Rosa will want to come back," she said. "Of course. Chester Howell will want to be invited. He will be offended if he is not. Then we invite Chester Howell." She smiled at him fully, without the ghost quality of before, a real smile that changed her face completely and made him feel he had been given something extraordinary. "Good," she said. He drove them home in the gold afternoon, and the cattle were in the pasture and the barn was solid, and the house was lit from within by the lamp she had left burning, and it looked like the most important place on earth. They were married in December of 1882, in a small ceremony in the parlor of the Everett house, which was now properly the Dalton house, though they had decided to keep the property registered as the Everett Dalton Ranch for practical purposes having to do with the bank and the association membership. Rosa came back from San Antonio with her husband and the children. Chester Howell attended, as predicted, and brought his wife Martha, who was sharp-eyed and warm and who took one look at Xavier and Opal together, and said to her husband quietly that she had never seen Opal Everett look like that, and was not that something. The preacher from Hardin's crossing performed the ceremony. They exchanged vows in the clear winter light coming through the parlor windows, and Opal's voice was steady and clear and did not tremble. And when Xavier said his vows, he looked at her the entire time, directly and without the slight theatrical excess that vows sometimes invite. And what was between them in that room was entirely private, even in front of witnesses. After the ceremony, in the afternoon gathering that followed, Rosa found Xavier at the edge of the room and pressed his hand and said, "Thank you." He looked at her. "It is the other direction," he said. Rosa shook her head. "She is my sister," she said. "I know what her life has been. Thank you for what you are giving her now." He thought about the sound of Opal laughing in the yard over a goat with a bucket on its head, and how that sound had decided something in him before he even knew what it was deciding. "She is giving it to herself," he said. "I am just here." Rosa smiled at him. "That is the right answer," she said, and went to find her children. The winter was mild, and the ranch thrived within its modest dimensions, and Xavier and Opal settled into a life together that was not without its difficulties. They were two strong-willed people who had survived different things, and who had to learn each other with the care and honesty that real learning requires. But that had at its center a quality of mutual respect and genuine love that made the difficulties manageable. When they disagreed, which they did with some regularity, they disagreed as equals and resolved their disagreements as equals, and neither of them won or lost. They negotiated, they adjusted, they arrived somewhere new together. Opal laughed regularly now. She laughed at the goat, still a reliable source of domestic comedy, and at the news in the weekly paper, and at Xavier's stories from his years on the move, and sometimes at nothing in particular, simply at the strange fact of being alive and content, and in a kitchen with a man she had married by choice and who made her coffee without being asked every morning without fail. Xavier watched her laugh, and it never stopped affecting him. It was the sound he had built his whole revised life toward, without knowing that was what he was doing, and every time he heard it, he thought about the afternoon at the corral, and the goat and the decision that had changed everything, and he was grateful in a way that had no appropriate vocabulary. In the spring of 1883 they broke ground on the north field as planned. The planting went well. The new cattle pen was built by June. The kitchen garden was expanded and produced abundantly, and Opal spent her evenings in the good weather doing the botanical study she had always wanted to do, documenting the native plants of the hill country in a careful journal that Xavier had given her for Christmas with blank pages. In August, Opal told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table with coffee the same way she told him most important things, directly, without ceremony, watching his face. He looked at her across the table, and the feeling that went through him was not one thing but many things at once, and they were all good, and he reached across the table and took her hand. "Good," he said, which was insufficient. She looked at him with that expression that was specifically his, the one she reserved for moments when she was letting him see her clearly. "I am glad," she said. "I was not certain I would be, but I am." "So am I," he said, "more than I can say." Their son was born in March of 1884, in the limestone house on the Hill Country Ranch on a morning when the bluebonnets were just beginning to come in along the road. They named him James Thomas Dalton, James for Xavier's father, Thomas in the careful, deliberate way that Opal had chosen it, not to honor a difficult marriage but to acknowledge a life she had lived, honestly and without erasure. The baby was healthy and loud and immediately opinionated in a way that made both his parents laugh, which was apparently enough of a family trait to be inherited. Rosa came to see him and declared him the best-looking of all her brother-in-law's children, which amused Xavier greatly since he had no other children, and they sat in the kitchen in the spring warmth with the baby passed between them, and Opal was present in a way she had not been in years, All of her there, all of her open, laughing at something Rosa said with the full laugh that Xavier had never grown tired of. The situation with Reginald Hale resolved itself, in the end, through the passage of time and the changing of circumstances. In 1884, the railroad came to Hardin County along a route that bypassed the Everett-Dalton land entirely and ran through a different water corridor, making Hale's strategic interest in the creek rights significantly less valuable. He made no further attempts on the property, and within 2 years had sold his own holdings in the county and relocated north. Xavier heard about this from Chester Howell with a satisfaction that he kept appropriately quiet about. The ranch grew in the years that followed, incrementally and soundly, the way a thing grows when it is built honestly and tended with care. They added cattle as the pasture and finances allowed. They hired 2 more hands as the herd expanded, good men who were treated fairly and who stayed. Opal's water rights committee work gave her influence in county matters that extended well beyond the ranch, and she used it consistently and effectively. They had a second child in 1887, a daughter named Rosa Clara Dalton, named with no great subtlety after Opal's sister and her old school friend in Denver, which made Rosa cry when she received the letter about it, and which she reported in her return letter with considerable lack of dignity and great affection. Xavier was 40 years old when his daughter was born, and he held her in the kitchen of the limestone house, and looked at Opal where she lay resting in the bedroom doorway watching him. And she looked back at him across the room with those gray-green eyes and the expression that was entirely his, and he thought about a fence line in the spring of 1882, and a sound like a vault opening, and a decision made without words at the edge of a corral. Never leaving. He had kept that promise with every morning he had woken up on this land, beside this woman, building this life. Not through sacrifice, but through the deep particular rightness of being exactly where you are meant to be. Opal watched him with the baby, and she was thinking, he knew, he had learned to read her so well by then that he knew, about the same things he was thinking about. The long road through hard years into this room. The work of becoming herself again. The startling, ordinary daily miracle of being loved by a man who saw her clearly and stayed anyway, who had never once been the person she was afraid he would eventually become. She had stopped being afraid of that some time ago. She could not name the exact day it had happened. It had simply, gradually, become impossible to maintain the fear against the consistent evidence of the man. He brought the baby to her and sat on the edge of the bed, and they looked at their daughter together in the late afternoon light. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Opal said. "Yes," he said, and kissed her temple, and their daughter grabbed his finger with the absolute confident grip of someone who had already decided this was a good situation. James was 3 and running circles in the yard outside, and they could hear him from the window, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the bluebonnets would be coming in along the road in another week. "I have been very happy," Opal said, which for her was not a small statement. He looked at her. Past tense, she looked at him with a slight expression that was not quite a smile but absolutely was. "Present," she said, "I have been and I am." He took her hand. She took his. Outside, James discovered something in the garden that delighted him enormously, and said so loudly. Inside, the baby made a small sound that was either complaint or commentary, and then settled against her mother's arm. The evening light came through the windows of the house that had been built by someone else and now belonged entirely, in all the ways that mattered, to them. Xavier Dalton, who had ridden onto this land with a tired horse and a letter of introduction and no plan beyond the next day, looked at the room and the woman and the baby and thought, as he had thought at a fence line years ago, watching a woman laugh over a ridiculous goat, that this was the most important moment of his life. The difference was that now there were so many of them. Moments like this, accumulated day upon day, so ordinary they were sometimes almost invisible, and so extraordinary he sometimes had to stop what he was doing and simply receive the fact of them. He never stopped being grateful. He never stopped choosing it. He never left. And in the spring and the summers and the winters and the autumns of the hill country of Texas, in the limestone house on the 400 acres along the creek, the Dalton family built a life that was honest and hard and full of laughter and love, and the good, faithful work of tending what you love. Opal kept her botanical journal, which eventually filled 3 volumes, and was referred to by the County Agricultural Association as a valuable local resource. She remained on the Water Rights Committee until 1891, when she was elected chair, and served in that capacity for 6 years with a precision and fairness that were universally respected and occasionally argued with, which she took as confirmation that she was doing the job correctly. Xavier ran the ranch with the same quiet competence he had brought to it from the beginning, and he trained his son carefully in the work of it, not because he expected James to inherit it as an obligation, but because he wanted to give him the knowledge to choose it freely if he wanted it. James did want it. He had his mother's precision and his father's patience, and by the time he was 16 he was capable of running a full day's work without supervision, and was already developing opinions about cattle breeds that were, his mother noted, occasionally more informed than his father's. The day Xavier heard this observation, delivered with a careful neutrality that did not conceal Opal's quiet satisfaction, he laughed, and she looked at him laughing and laughed herself. And Rosa Clara, who was 7 and found adults entirely baffling, went back out to the porch to watch the goat, who was still, after all these years, an unreliable member of the household and could be counted on to provide entertainment. Some things did not change. The best of them were permanent.